There are some stories the world will never forget. Stories so powerful, they survive generations. And then there is the story of the vehicle RMS Titanic, the British ocean liner. A ship built to conquer the ocean, a symbol of wealth, power, and human ambition, but also the setting of one of the deadliest tragedies in human history. More than 2,200 people stepped aboard, believing they were beginning the journey of a lifetime. Many of them would never see land again. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the complete story of the Titanic, how it was built, who traveled on it, what really happened the night it struck the iceberg, and why, more than 100 years later, the Titanic still fascinates the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, crossing the Atlantic Ocean meant traveling by ship. Airplanes barely existed, and shipping companies competed fiercely to build the biggest, fastest, and most luxurious vessels on Earth. One of those companies was the White Star Line. Their goal wasn't simply to build a ship. They wanted to build a legend. The Titanic was constructed in the city of Belfast, Northern Ireland, United Kingdom. Thousands of workers spent years building what many believed would become the greatest ship ever created. It stretched nearly 270 meters long. It was like a floating city. Inside were grand staircases, luxury suites, elegant restaurants, electric lighting, cafes, smoking lounges, libraries, a swimming pool, and even a gymnasium. For 1912, it felt like the future itself. But the most dangerous thing about the Titanic was not the ship. It was the confidence people had in it. Newspapers began calling it unsinkable. People believed modern engineering had defeated nature, would become one of the greatest ironies in history. For first-class passengers, life aboard the Titanic was extraordinary. They dined on expensive meals prepared by elite chefs. They drank champagne beneath crystal chandeliers. Live orchestras performed music while wealthy guests laughed and celebrated. Some rooms looked more luxurious than royal palaces. But deep below the glamorous decks, another world existed. Third-class passengers traveled in much simpler conditions. Many were immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Sweden. Families chasing hope. Hope for money. Hope for freedom. Hope for a better future in America. To them, the Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a new beginning. On April 10, 1912, crowds gathered at the docks in Southampton, England. Families hugged goodbye. Workers rushed across the decks. Smoke poured from the giant funnels. And finally, the Titanic began its maiden voyage. People waved proudly from the shore as the largest moving object ever built by humanity slowly disappeared into the ocean. Everything seemed perfect, but from the beginning, warnings had already arrived. Several ships reported dangerous iceberg fields in the North Atlantic. Wireless operators received message after message warning about ice ahead. Still, the Titanic continued moving at high speed. The crew believed the ship could survive almost anything, and nobody wanted to delay the voyage. Then came the night of April 14, 1912. The ocean was unusually calm. Too calm. There were almost no waves, making icebergs harder to see in the darkness. Was freezing. The sky was black. And at 11:40 p.m., two lookouts suddenly saw something directly ahead. An iceberg. Massive, silent, deadly. They rang the warning bell immediately, 3 times. The bridge reacted instantly. The ship tried turning away. The engines reversed, but it was already too late. The Titanic avoided a direct collision, yet the iceberg scraped violently along the side of the ship. At first, many passengers barely noticed the impact. Some thought nothing had happened. But below deck, freezing Atlantic water rushed into several compartments. The damage was catastrophic. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, inspected the flooding personally. After calculating everything, he reached a horrifying conclusion. The Titanic was going to sink, and it only had about 2 hours left. At first, many passengers refused to believe it. How could the Titanic sink? This was supposed to be the safest ship ever built. Some people continued drinking, others laughed nervously, some ignored the warnings completely. But slowly, reality spread across the decks. Lifeboats were uncovered. Passengers were ordered to wear life jackets. Women and children first. That was the rule. But there was another terrible problem. The Titanic did not have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Even worse, some boats left only half full, because people still believed the ship would remain afloat. Imagine that. Thousands of people trapped in the middle of the freezing Atlantic Ocean, and many still could not accept what was happening. Meanwhile, the ship's orchestra continued playing music, not to entertain people, but to keep them calm, even as death approached. Of the most haunting images in history. Musicians playing while the Titanic slowly died beneath them. As water flooded the front of the ship, the bows sank lower and lower into the ocean. Panic exploded. People screamed. Families became separated. Some jumped into the freezing water. Others prayed. Some simply stood frozen in shock. The Atlantic Ocean that night was colder than ice. Anyone entering it would likely survive only minutes. By around 2 a.m., the back of the ship lifted high into the air. Lights flickered across the decks. Then suddenly, the unimaginable happened. The Titanic broke apart. One of the largest ships ever created snapped in half in the middle of the ocean. The sound must have been terrifying. Metal twisting, glass shattering, people screaming in darkness. And then, at approximately 2:20 a.m., the Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic forever. More than 1,500 people died that night. Most froze to death in the icy water. After the ship vanished, the ocean became almost silent, except for the cries of survivors floating helplessly in the darkness. Hours later, the rescue ship RMS Carpathia finally arrived. But for most victims, it was already too late. The survivors who climbed aboard carried unimaginable trauma. Some had lost husbands, others lost wives, children, entire families disappeared in a single night. When news of the disaster reached the world, people were shocked. How could the greatest ship ever built vanish on its first voyage? Newspapers everywhere covered the tragedy. And suddenly, the Titanic became more than just a ship. It became a warning, a symbol of human pride and the dangerous belief that humanity could completely control nature. For decades, nobody knew exactly where the Titanic rested. The Atlantic Ocean had swallowed it whole. Then, in 1985, explorer Robert Ballard, an American oceanographer, finally discovered the wreck, nearly 4,000 meters below the surface. The ship had broken into two massive sections. Seeing the wreck shocked the world all over again. Shoes, suitcases, dishes, personal belongings, pieces of human lives frozen in time beneath the ocean floor. Even today, the Titanic continues slowly disappearing as bacteria consume the metal. One day, the wreck itself may completely vanish, but its story never will. And maybe that is why people remain obsessed with the Titanic more than a century later. Because behind the famous ship were real people, real dreams, real fears, real families. Some became heroes, some became victims, and all of them became part of history forever. The Titanic was supposed to prove humanity could dominate nature. Instead, nature reminded humanity how fragile we truly are. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the world changed forever. The Titanic disappeared beneath the icy Atlantic Ocean. But the story survived. Even now, more than 100 years later, people still talk about it, still study it, still imagine what those final moments must have felt like. Because the Titanic was never just a ship. It was a dream, and the ocean destroyed it in a single night. After the sinking of the entity, the RMS Titanic, the British ocean liner, the ocean became silent again. But the world on land would never be the same. In the freezing darkness of the North Atlantic, Hundreds of survivors struggled to stay alive in lifeboats scattered across the sea. Many of them were still in shock, unable to understand what had just happened. Only hours earlier, they had been on the most luxurious ship in the world. Now, they were floating in complete darkness, surrounded by endless water and death. Some lifeboats were half empty. Others were filled with crying passengers holding blankets, praying for dawn. The temperature was so low that many of the people who fell into the water died within minutes. The ocean itself became the true killer that night. Not the iceberg, not the ship, but the freezing Atlantic. In the distance, the Titanic had disappeared completely beneath the surface. Only debris remained floating: wood, chairs, luggage, and fragments of human life. On board one of the lifeboats was a woman who would later become famous for her survival story, Margaret Molly Brown. She encouraged others to row, to stay strong, and to go back for survivors, even when fear took over. Her courage would later earn her the name, the unsinkable Molly Brown. But not all boats turned back. Most could not. The ocean was too dark, too cold, too dangerous. Around 2 hours after the sinking, a distant light finally appeared on the horizon. It was the RMS Carpathia. The rescue ship had raced through dangerous ice fields at full speed after receiving distress signals. When it arrived, the survivors broke into tears. Some cried in relief. Others cried because they already knew their loved ones were gone. The Carpathia pulled survivors aboard one by one, wet, frozen, and traumatized passengers. Wrapped in blankets, stood in silence as the reality of the disaster set in. Out of more than 2,200 people, only around 700 survived. The rest were lost to the sea. When the Carpathia finally arrived in New York City, the world was waiting. News had already spread across the globe by radio and telegraph. Crowds gathered at the docks in silence. There were no celebrations, only grief. Families searched desperately for names on survivor lists. Many never found what they hoped for. At the same time, investigations began immediately. 2 major inquiries were launched, one in the United States and one in the United Kingdom. Officials wanted answers. How could the most advanced ship in the world sink on its first voyage? The British inquiry focused on ship design, safety regulations, and human decisions. The American inquiry examined survivor testimonies in detail, trying to reconstruct every moment of the disaster. One of the key findings was shocking. The Titanic had received multiple iceberg warnings throughout the day. But many of those warnings never reached the bridge in time, or were not treated with urgency. Another critical issue was speed. Despite warnings of ice ahead, the ship continued traveling at high velocity through dangerous waters. Then there was the problem of lifeboats. The ship simply did not carry enough to save everyone on board. This decision was not considered unusual at the time, because regulations were outdated. But after the disaster, it became one of the most criticized failures in maritime history. Radio operators also came under scrutiny. On nearby ships, distress signals from the Titanic were not immediately acted upon. One ship, the Californian, had seen rockets in the distance, but failed to fully respond. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Captain Edward Smith, the commander of the Titanic, went down with his ship. Some survivors reported seeing him on the bridge in the final moments, calm and silent as the situation became hopeless. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, also died during the sinking, after reportedly helping passengers find safety. Meanwhile, the ship's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, stayed at their posts, sending distress calls until the very end. Their messages were the last lifeline the Titanic had. CQD, CQD, SOS. Those signals traveled through the night sky, reaching distant ships and changing maritime communication forever. After the disaster, major reforms were introduced. International safety regulations were rewritten. The International Ice Patrol was created to monitor iceberg dangers in the Atlantic. New laws required enough lifeboats for all passengers, Radio operators were required to maintain continuous watch. The world had learned a painful lesson. The sinking of the Titanic was not caused by a single mistake. It was the result of many small decisions, assumptions, and overconfidence in technology. But beyond the technical failures, there was something deeper. Human belief, the belief that nature could be controlled, that progress meant safety, that a ship could be declared unsinkable. And nature answered that belief in the most brutal way possible. In the years that followed, the story of the Titanic spread across books, films, and documentaries. It became more than a tragedy. It became a symbol, a reminder of human ambition and human fragility. Even the ocean kept its secrets for decades. No one knew the exact location of the wreck. Until 1985, when explorer Robert Ballard finally found the remains, resting nearly 4,000 meters beneath the surface. The ship was broken into two main sections, surrounded by debris fields that stretched across the seabed. Personal items still remained: shoes, luggage, fragments of life frozen in time. It was like the ocean had preserved the final moments of history itself. Today, the wreck of the Titanic is slowly decaying. Microorganisms in the deep ocean are consuming the steel. One day, the ship will disappear completely. But its story will remain. Because the Titanic is not just about a ship. It is about people, dreams, choices, and consequences. It is a reminder that even the greatest human achievements are still vulnerable, and that the ocean always wins. After the world began to understand what happened to the vehicle called the RMS Titanic, something unexpected happened. The story did not end. It grew. It spread across generations, becoming one of the most retold tragedies in human history. But for decades, the exact resting place of the Titanic remained unknown. The ocean had swallowed it completely. No cameras had ever seen it. No one had ever touched it. It became a legend, buried under nearly 4,000 meters of darkness. Scientists, explorers, and oceanographers became obsessed with finding it. Many believed it would never be located. The deep Atlantic Ocean was vast, cold, and nearly impossible to explore with early technology. But in 1985, everything changed. Explorer Robert Ballard and his team finally located the wreck of the Titanic. What they found shocked the world. The ship was not intact. It had broken into two massive sections, lying far apart on the ocean floor. Around it, a field of debris stretched across the seabed like a frozen memory. Shoes, dishes, suitcases, metal fragments, objects that once belonged to real people, now resting in complete silence. It was not just a shipwreck. It was a time capsule of human tragedy. Images of the discovery spread around the world. For the first time, people could see the real remains of the Titanic. And the emotional impact was enormous. The ocean had preserved the final moment of a lost world. But even after its discovery, the Titanic continued to capture attention in another way. It became part of culture, art, books, documentaries, and eventually cinema. Every generation found a new way to tell its story. One of the most famous interpretations came through film, bringing the tragedy to millions of people worldwide. For many, it was their first emotional connection to the disaster. But behind every adaptation, the real story remained the same. A ship filled with dreams, a voyage filled with hope, and a night that changed everything. As time passed, scientists also began to study the wreck itself. Deep-sea missions returned again and again to the site. They discovered that the Titanic was slowly disappearing. Not all at once, but little by little. Bacteria living in the deep ocean were consuming the iron structure. A unique organism even earned the nickname rusticles because of the way it slowly eats the metal like icicles of rust. This means that one day, the Titanic will no longer exist physically, Only images, videos, and memories will remain. But perhaps that makes the story even more powerful, because it is not just about the wreck. It is about what happened before it became a wreck. The people, the choices, the warnings, and the belief that something so massive, so advanced, and so modern could never fail. The Titanic also changed how the world views technology. Before the disaster, many believed that engineering had reached a level where nature could be fully controlled. After the disaster, that illusion was broken. Ships became safer, rules became stricter, lifeboat requirements changed, radio communication became constant, and new systems were developed to track icebergs in the Atlantic Ocean. But no regulation could bring back the lives lost that night. More than 1,500 people died, each one with a story, each one with dreams that never came true. Some were wealthy passengers traveling in luxury suites. Others were immigrants hoping for a better future in America. Children were lost in the chaos, and entire futures disappeared beneath the freezing water. The Titanic reminds us that history is not just made of events, it is made of people. And those people were real. Today, the story of the Titanic continues to be studied in schools, universities, museums, and documentaries around the world. It is used as an example of human ambition, of technological progress, and of tragic failure. But also of bravery. Because even in the darkest moments, there were acts of courage. Musicians continued playing as the ship sank. Crew members helped passengers into lifeboats. Some individuals gave their own seats to others. And in the middle of disaster, humanity still appeared in unexpected ways. That is why the Titanic story continues to survive. It is not only about death, it is also about humanity, and how fragile it truly is. Standing today more than a century later, the Titanic still rests at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, silent, broken, slowly disappearing, but never forgotten. Every expedition that visits it brings back the same feeling: respect, sadness, and reflection. Because when people look at the wreck, they are not just looking at metal, they are looking at history. A moment frozen in time, a warning written in steel and water, and a reminder that no matter how advanced humanity becomes, nature will always have the final word. The Titanic was meant to be a symbol of triumph. Instead, it became a symbol of humility. And that is why, more than 100 years later, we still tell its story. Because the Titanic is not just something that happened in the past. It is a lesson, one that continues to echo across time. And it always will.